What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. It's been a while since I've said that, so for our return, we decided to do a few games for you today. Timestamps are on screen for both games. It's the same pod, just two different matches, featuring a few new commanders to the channel and some fan favorites, and I think you'll really enjoy the gameplay we have for you. With this return, our area has allowed us to meet up in smaller groups, so because of this, we have started to record in person, still making sure to remain safe and sanitary. However, we are streaming these recording sessions on Twitch, so our live in-person recording sessions every Sunday at 6 p.m. EST over on twitch.tv/CasuallyCompetitiveMTG. Check that out if you want to watch these games live. Now, before we get started, if you do want to help support the channel, we do have a few different options available. First off, we have a Patreon if you want to help support us in that way, and we also have a merch store. Both of the links for these are in the description. If you do want to help us out in this way, we do greatly appreciate it, and it really does go a long way to help support the channel. Now, there are a few places that we affiliate with, so if you're interested in buying cards in the near future, there's a TCG affiliate link in the description. After clicking on that link, any purchase you make will directly help the channel at no additional cost to you. And also in the description, there is a link for Flipside Gaming, where if you use our code CasuallyMTG at checkout, you will get 10% off any eligible purchase of $10 or more, so be sure to check that out. And for the month of July, we are partnering with Flipside Gaming to do a double Masters box giveaway. There's a link in the description with the full details, but now with the self-promotion out of the way, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first in this game is Bill playing Korvold Fae-Cursed King. Bill's goal for this deck is to win using a food chain combo in order to essentially infinitely cast something like Squee the Immortal, which he can exile the food chain to generate mana and then recast from exile to generate infinite creature mana, and then use Korvold as a card draw outlet in order to draw one of the cards he needs in order to win, like an Impact Tremors or a Blood Artist. Bill's opening hand contained a Marsh Flats, a Birds of Paradise, a Boreal Druid, a Llanowar Elves, a Viscera Seer, a Felwar Stone, and a Praetor's Grasp. Going second is Joseph playing Elsha of the Infinite. This is a combo-based deck that looks to use Sensei's Divining Top in addition to a cost reducer like Ethereum Sculptor or Helm of Awakening in order to play the Divining Top for free, and then with Elsha's ability, drawing his deck and then winning with his deck in his hand. And there are backup lines in this deck that include Underworld, Breach, and Brain Freeze to kind of do the same thing. Joseph's opening hand contains 6 cards, and those were a Polluted Delta, a Soul Ring, a Mystic Remora, a Helm of Awakening, a Brain Freeze, a Basalt Monolith, and due to the London Mulligan, he put a Not Forgotten to the bottom. Up next is Jordan playing the Rakdos commander Anje Falkenrath. The aim of this deck is to essentially pack the deck full of Madness cards and then rummage through your library by discarding one, drawing another card, untapping Anje, and doing that to generate value, all while working through a combo that involves the World Gorger Dragon and something like an Animate Dead to generate infinite mana, and then win through a Walking Ballista or another infinite mana outlet. Jordan also kept 6 cards in this game, and his opening hand contained a Swamp, a City of Brass, a Mana Crypt, an Entomb, a Dark Confidant, a Fire Covenant, and he put a Bloodhall Priest to the bottom. And finally, going last in this game is Adam playing Prime Speaker Vannifar. This deck looks to play one of the most confusing and convoluted combo lines I've seen in one of these deck introductions, and essentially use Vannifar's ability to chain tutor a series of creatures that allows him to win the game. There will be a deck list link in the description that will explain the main combo line. Adam's opening hand contained 2 Forests, a Breeding Pool, a Soul Ring, a Vitalize, a Trinket Mage, and a Deadeye Navigator. Now, if you want to vote for your favorite commander to see it in a fan favorites, there will be a Twitter poll link in the description below, but without any further ado, let's get into the gameplay. Bill kicks off this game by playing a Marsh Flats and then paying 1 life to crack it to find an untapped Overgrown Tomb, losing 3 total life. He then uses this Overgrown Tomb to cast a Birds of Paradise, and with nothing left, gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph goes to his turn, plays a Polluted Delta as his land, and then pays 1 life to crack it to search an untapped Hollowed Fountain, paying 2 more life. He then taps his Hollowed Fountain to cast a Soul Ring, and he then taps the Soul Ring to cast everyone's favorite artifact, Cursed Totem. Cursed Totem resolves, and Joseph gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan plays a City of Brass as his land, and then for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. He then takes 1 damage from the City of Brass to help cast a Dark Confidant floating a colorless mana, and with nothing left to do, gives the turn to Adam. Adam plays a Forest, and then taps that Forest to cast a Soul Ring. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and then plays a Crystal Vein as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Fellwar Stone. He then taps his Fellwar Stone for a green to cast a Land of War Elves. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and then for 1 blue mana, casts a Mystic Remora. The Remora resolves, and then, with no land drops to make, has to just give the turn to Jordan. Jordan goes to his turn, untaps, takes 3 damage from losing his Mana Crypt trigger, and then reveals a Mausoleum Secrets off the Dark Confidant trigger, losing 2 life. He then plays a Swamp as his land, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Anje Falkenrath. He then goes to combat and swings his Hasty Commander at Bill and Dark Confidant at Joseph. Neither declare any blockers. Bill takes 1, Joseph takes 2, and Jordan gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays an untapped Breeding Pool as his land, paying 2 life, and he then plays a Birds of Paradise. He then taps his mana to cast a Trinket Mage, which, when it enters the battlefield, searches him up a Mana Crypt to his hand. With nothing left, Adam ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his first main phase, taps for 3 mana to cast a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Joseph and not paying for Mystic Remora. Joseph draws, the Grasp then resolves, and Bill searches Joseph's library for a card, exiles it face down, and he then goes to combat and swings his Land of War Elves at Jordan, who declares no blockers and takes a damage. Bill then gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and in his upkeep, pays for Mystic Remora, floating 1 mana off a Soul Ring, and he then goes to his draw step and his first main phase. In his first main phase, he casts a Preordain, scrying 2 cards, 1 to the top, 1 to the bottom, and then drawing that top card. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Lotus Petal, and with nothing left, gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then takes 1 damage off of Dark Confidant from revealing a Call to the Netherworld. He then goes to combat and swings both the Confidant and his commander at Bill for 3 total damage. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays an island, and then taps for 4 to cast Prime Speaker Vannifar. He then goes to combat and swings his Trinket Mage at Jordan, who declares no blockers, and Jordan then takes 2 damage. With nothing left, Adam gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and then taps for 1 mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. He does not pay for Mystic Remora, Joseph draws, and then he pays 1 black mana to cast a Viscera Seer. With nothing left, Bill ships the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, pays for Mystic Remora, plays a Plains as his land for turn, and then sacrifices his Lotus Petal for a red to help cast a Dockside Extortionist. There are no responses to Dockside, it enters the battlefield, and when it enters, he gets 4 treasure tokens. He then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then reveals a Mana Confluence to the Dark Confidant trigger, not taking any additional damage. He then plays this Mana Confluence as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Biforce, X equaling 4. He takes 2 damage from his lands, and does not pay for Mystic Remora, so Joseph draws a card. His targets for Biforce were Joseph's Soul Ring, Adam's Soul Ring, Bill's Fellwar Stone, and Bill's Sensei's Divining Top. In response to the cast, Bill pays 1 mana to activate his Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards of his library, and he then taps the top to draw a card and put the top back on top. There are no further responses to Biforce, and the artifacts are destroyed. With nothing left to do, Jordan decides to give the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, plays a Forest as his land, and then, for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. He does not pay for Mystic Remora, Joseph draws, and then Adam taps his mana to cast a Deadeye Navigator. When it enters the battlefield, he has it bond to Trinket Mage, and he then goes to combat and swings his commander and the Trinket Mage at Bill. Bill blocks Vannifar with his Dork and then takes 2 total damage, and Adam then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws the Divining Top that he had put on top of his library, and he then taps 1 mana to cast this Divining Top, not paying for Mystic Remora. He then, remembering the top card of his library due to activating the Divining Top previously, taps his top to draw that card. He then exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand for a red mana to help him cast his own copy of Dockside Extortionist. There are no responses, and when it enters the battlefield, he generates 8 treasure tokens. Bill then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph taps for a white mana to cast an Enlightened Tutor. Again, there are no responses to this tutor, and Joseph searches up an Underworld Breach to the top of his library. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep does not pay for Mystic Remora, and he then draws his Underworld Breach. He starts off this turn by paying 2 mana to cast a Helm of Awakening. He then pays 1 red mana to cast an Underworld Breach. He then, for 1 blue mana, casts a Brain Freeze targeting himself. Now, there are 9 cards that will be milled with this, and since the Lotus Petal is in his graveyard, Joseph shows a series of steps where he can cast his Lotus Petal for 0 mana by exiling 3 cards due to Underworld Breach, and then sacrifice it for a blue to recast Brain Freeze from his graveyard, targeting himself each time. Now, what this will allow him to do is essentially mill his entire library, and all he needs to do is exile 6 cards from his graveyard each time, and each time he performs this loop, he'll be milling 6 additional cards due to playing 2 spells and upping the storm counter 2 times each time this loop is performed. Now, with his entire library in his graveyard except for the exiled cards, Joseph plays some cheap mana rocks like Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, and Arcane Signet from his graveyard. He then casts Not Forgotten from his graveyard, targeting Dramatic Reversal to put it back in his library, and he then draws a card using something like a Cataxian Probe. He then draws Dramatic Reversal, and again from his graveyard, casts an Isochron Scepter. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints Dramatic Reversal, and he then makes infinite mana. With this infinite mana, he casts Elsha and gets Infinite Storm, making Elsha infinitely big from prowess. He then casts Swords to Plowshares from his graveyard, targeting Elsha, gaining infinite life, let's just say 100,000, and he then casts Rolling Earthquake for 40, killing the table and winning the game. Now, we didn't play it out on stream, but as the Elsha player, I would have needed about 21 to 30 cards to exile, which is just essentially all of the lands I have in that deck, and since I got there with Brain Freeze and had enough cards in my graveyard to start the loop, there was no way I fizzle at that point. Now, you may be wondering why it takes such a complicated loop to win with this deck, and the reason is I don't like adding cards that are instantly dead, like a Laboratory Maniac or a Thassa's Oracle. Even though they do win the game, they're not useful throughout the game, so I like to focus this deck around cards that are generally useful. Brain Freeze is a good card that can just be disruption if I needed to. Underworld Breach is a solid card. Isochron Scepter all have value in the mid game, so I like to avoid cards like Thassa's Oracle and Laboratory Maniac because they don't help me in the mid game and they only help me win, and I'd rather just win by drawing my library and then throwing cards on the table in a certain order to win the game. This theory is called a win-conless deck, and this isn't a pure win-conless deck because there are some cards that would be considered win-cons, but it's about halfway there, I would say. It's just the style of deck I like to play, and I find it very interesting to build around. If that's a style of deck that interests you, I would highly suggest looking up win-conless decks. And that's actually my post-game recap, to talk about why I win with Elsha in this way. I think it's very fun, unique, and it just gives a whole nother level of deck building because you're not just focusing on a win con and building around it, you're focusing on a lot of valuable pieces and a way to draw your library, and then just putting those all together. They're good on their own, but they also win the game in the right combination. Anyway, remember, if you do want to vote on your favorite commander, there's a Twitter poll link in the description. YouTube polls aren't going to work anymore, so we're trying out Twitter, but let's just get right into game number 2. The decks and the turn order actually were the same for game number 2, so we'll start off with Bill playing Korvold Fae-Cursed King. Bill's opening hand contained a swamp, a forest, a city of brass, a Fintorn Elves, a Viscera Seer, an Arcane Signet, and a Plunge into Darkness. Going next again was Joseph playing Elsha of the Infinite, and his opening hand contained a Polluted Delta, a Windswept Heath, a Hollowed Fountain, a Pact of Negation, a Pyroblast, a Deflecting Swat, and a Cloud Key. Going third is Jordan playing Anje Falkenrath, and his opening hand contained a Scalding Tarn, a Chrome Mox, a Walking Ballista, a Mausoleum Secrets, a Dark Confidant, a Grave Scrabbler, and a Nightshade Assassin. And finally is Adam playing Prime Speaker Vannifar. His opening hand contained a forest, an island, a command tower, a Hall of the Bandit Lord, a Mana Crypt, a Llanowar Elves, and a Fate Stitcher. But with the opening hands out of the way, let's get into turn number 1 for game number 2. Bill starts off the second game by playing a forest and then tapping that forest to cast a Fintorn Elves. He then gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph plays a Polluted Delta and then decides to just ship the turn to Jordan. Jordan, on his turn, plays a Scalding Tarn, and then cracks it, paying 1 life to search up a Blood Crypt, paying 2 more life to have it enter untapped. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Chrome Mox, and when it enters the battlefield, he imprints Nightshade Assassin. He then, for 2 mana, casts a Dark Confidant. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Adam. Adam, on his turn, plays a Command Tower as his land, and then taps that Command Tower to cast a Llanowar Elves. Then for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt, and he then taps that Mana Crypt to cast Swiftfoot Boots. With nothing left to do, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land, and then taps for 2 mana to cast an Arcane Signet. He then taps the Signet to cast a Viscera Seer. With nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Bill's end step, Joseph pays 1 life to crack his Polluted Delta to search up a tapped Steam Vents to the battlefield. Joseph then goes to his turn, and in his first main phase, pays 2 life to have his Hollowed Fountain enter untapped, and he then taps for 2 mana to cast a Dockside Extortionist. It resolves, and when it enters the battlefield, he gets 4 treasure tokens to the battlefield. With nothing left to do, however, he does have to just give the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep reveals a Demonic Tutor to the Dark Confidant trigger, taking 2 damage. He then casts his Demonic Tutor to search up a card to his hand, and with nothing left to do, gives the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then plays an island as his land for turn, and taps for 4 mana to cast his commander, Prime Speaker Vannifar. In response, Joseph, not liking the Prime Speaker and the Swiftfoot Boots combination, decides to crack a treasure for red to cast a Pyroblast, countering Adam's commander. With nothing left to do, Adam gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and then taps for 1 red mana to cast a Faithless Looting. He draws 2 cards, and then discards a Swamp and a Mountain. He then plays a City of Brass as his land, and then gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, plays a Windswept Heath as his land, and then immediately pays 1 life to crack it to search up a Plains to the battlefield. He then uses 2 of his treasures to help cast his commander, Elsha of the Infinite. It resolves, and he then looks at the top card of his library, and with nothing left to do on his turn, ships the turn over to Jordan. Jordan untaps and reveals a Necromancy to the Dark Confidant trigger, taking 3 damage. In his first main phase, he then taps for 2 mana to cast his own Dockside Extortionist, which, when it enters the battlefield, also gets Jordan 4 treasures. He then uses some of these treasures to help cast his commander, Anje Falkenrath. He then taps his hasty commander to discard a Grave Scrabbler to draw a card, and since it had Madness, it untaps Anje. He then repeats this process, discarding a Psychotic Episode, and then does it 1 more time to discard a Fiery Temper. Now, since it has Madness, he decides to use his last treasure to cast Fiery Temper, targeting Joseph's Elsha. In response to this, Joseph for 0 mana casts a Deflecting Swat, attempting to change the target from Elsha to Anje. In response to Deflecting Swat, Jordan decides to tap Anje 1 last time to discard a Bifrost, draw 1 card, and then Anje takes 3 damage and dies. With nothing left, Jordan goes to pass the turn to Adam, and on Jordan's end step, Bill taps for 2 mana to cast a Plunge into Darkness. It resolves, and he decides to pay 35 life into this spell, looking at the top 35 cards of his library and then exiling 34 of them, keeping 1 in his hand. Notable exiles with this pile is Squee the Immortal. With nothing left, Adam continues to his turn, and in his upkeep, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then plays a Forest as his land, and then taps his mana to cast a Woodland Bellower. When it enters the battlefield, he searches his library for a creature, and unfortunately doesn't have anything that really can stop a food chain during Bill's main phase, so he grabs a Priest of Titania just in case it makes it back to his turn. With nothing left, Adam gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Crystal Vein as his land, and then for 3 mana, casts Food Chain. When Food Chain resolves, he taps the Fyndhorn Elves to generate a green mana, and then exiles it to Food Chain for 2 red mana in order to cast Squee from exile. He then loops Squee through Food Chain to generate infinite creature mana, and he then replays Squee and then plays his commander with some of his infinite mana. When Korvold enters the battlefield, he sacrifices Squee to draw a card, and he then exiles his commander Korvold to Food Chain and then decides to put him back into the command zone. He then replays Squee, replays his commander, and continues this loop until he draws a Blood Artist. He then plays this Blood Artist with some of his infinite creature mana, and then continually replays and exiles Squee to drain his opponents and win the game. Now, these games may have been short, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast when you play some of these higher powered or cEDH decks, but we still felt that they were relatively entertaining and we wanted to make them into a video. Now, really quick, I want to talk about this game a little bit because I think there was a drastic, maybe oversight that's interesting to talk about. Now, I was the Elsha player, and when I played Dockside Extortionist, my goal was to just try to get some value, maybe get Elsha out a little bit early, and just try to do something to get myself into this game. I kept a really bad opening hand with my only real gas piece or combo piece being Cloud Key, and really no gas pieces, no card draw, really nothing. So I was really relying on the interaction that I had in my hand to grind the game out so I could find something that I needed. Now, my major misplay was playing Elsha rather than holding up the mana for Pact of Negation. Now, in hindsight, this was obvious, but in the game, it still should have been fairly obvious. Sure, Elsha essentially gives me one card draw by letting me look at the top card, but when half of the cards in my deck can't be played with Elsha, it really does narrow what I can do, especially when I had a surefire way to stop any combo in my hand with Pact of Negation. Now, playing Pact of Negation would have put me pretty far behind, however the game would have still gone on, and I may have drawn something that would have helped me win the game, and kind of just using all of my resources to play Elsha with having no control available, I think was probably a pretty big oversight, and it's something to keep in mind when you do decide to keep these second 7 hands that just really have nothing in them except for lands and interaction. It's always a good idea to be aware of what your opponents are doing and keep the interaction up for when you need it. Anyway, that is all I have for kind of a post-game recap. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this first episode back. Again, if you want to watch us play these games live while we're recording them, head on over to twitch.tv/CasuallyCompetitiveMTG. We would love to see you guys there. And if you're interested in any type of D&D, we will also be trying out a D&D stream actually tonight if you're watching this video when it was released. We'd love to see you guys there to that as well. That being said, that is all we have for this video. We do hope you enjoyed it. It is good to be back, and we hope you're excited for the videos we have planned. But like I said, I am Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG. We hope you have a fantastic rest of the week, and we will see you next time.